I want to draw from what Jesus teaches in Matthew chapter 9. And this passage in Matthew chapter 9, I'm going to turn there. I'd like to read that very quickly to put our minds in the place where we're studying. Matthew chapter 9, verses 14 through 18. Then the disciples of John came to him, saying, "Why do we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" And Jesus said to them, "Can the wedding guests mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast. No one puts a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch tears away from the garment, and a worse tear is made. Neither is new wine put into old wineskins. If it is, the skins burst, and the wine is spilled, and the skins are destroyed. But new wine is put into fresh wineskins, and so both are preserved." Now, in this passage, you might wonder why in the world I decided to talk about this, but I had a request from a member of 2nd Street concerning Old and New Testament. And so I think it's important for us to understand the Apostle Paul in the book of Romans, and I don't have the passage in front of me, says of the things that were written aforetime were written for our learning, so that we through patience of the Scriptures might have hope. So Paul says that the things of the Old Testament, as he's referring to them, things that were written aforetime or in former days, some translations will say, those things are important for us to study. And so I don't want to discount the Old Testament, but we are New Testament Christians. So what's going on here? I guess if I were to sum it up, Jesus is breaking with tradition. The traditional Jewish religious people of his day would have, as John's disciples and as the Pharisees, they would have clung to the idea of fasting. Jesus, on the other hand, his disciples, Jesus breaks a lot of rules. He really does. In the previous paragraph, I want you to notice something. When Jesus Jesus reclined, verse 10, and Jesus reclined at table in the house. Behold, many tax collectors and sinners were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" So what's going on here is because Jesus is breaking with tradition. Even today, there's no organization, I think, in America that is more hated than the IRS. You want to be a public enemy number one? Become an IRS agent. And I suspect you'll probably find out what hatred really is. And so Jesus, it was probably even more intense. At least we love our government. We love the freedoms that they provide. Jesus, on the other hand, the time in which he lived, these tax collectors were employed by Rome. They worked for the Roman government collecting taxes for the occupying army. It would be like Russia setting up tax collectors in Ukraine. You know, they're going to be the most hated people in the world. These were Jews who chose to basically, the way they were viewed, quote, sell their souls for a job in the Roman government. Not only that, but they had a reputation of lining their own pockets, collecting a little bit more than their due. They would tuck that into their own pocket, so many of them became rich and wealthy. Matthew, the author of the gospel, is among the tax collectors. So when John's disciples come, they're hedging the tax collection issue. The Pharisees don't hedge the issue, although they don't talk to Jesus about it. You ever notice how many people don't talk to the source? Problem number one. You know, we have a prime example here of gossip, essentially. Hey, Mike, what's going on with Patty back there? You know, that sort of thing. And we don't go to Patty and ask what's going on. This is it's not a good situation, but it is something that has happened repeatedly over the years and continues, sadly enough, to happen today. And so, I have to credit John's disciples. They go to Jesus. Pharisees didn't do that. But their issue really probably was not so much with the tax collectors, because after all, John taught repentance. So they had an understanding, maybe, of what Jesus was doing. But they asked him a question. And really the question of the day is more than just fasting. The question of the day is, why are you breaking with what is traditionally seen as Old Testament customs? Now, fasting was certainly for the Old Testament. I believe if a New Testament Christian wants to fast, there's instructions in the New Testament as to how to fast. I'll give you some quick references for that. But fasting in the Old Testament was seen as a time of purging yourself of things or depriving yourself of things that you enjoy. And that was for the purpose of setting those things aside so that you could reflect with God, you could reflect on your failures, you could repent of your sin, and you could, generally speaking, in a general sense, draw closer to God by purging those things out of the way. And so Daniel, if you go back into Daniel's book in the Old Testament, Daniel was trying to draw closer to God in Daniel chapter 10. And if I can get here, Daniel chapter 10 and in verse 2 and 3, it says, in those days I, Daniel, was mourning for 3 weeks. So here, that's the purpose of Daniel's fasting. And quite frankly, people may not call it a fast today, but when you're in mourning, I can tell you one thing, our lives at 2nd Street have been turned upside down since the death of Miss Cynthia. And so there's a lot of times when you're mentally drained, you just simply don't feel like eating. Well, Daniel says that he was in mourning for 3 weeks. He says, I ate no delicacies, no meat or wine entered my mouth, nor did I anoint myself at all for the full 3 weeks. And so Daniel fasted for 3 weeks. All right, so this is just an example of Old Testament fasting. While we're in this section, let's go over a couple of books in the Old Testament, the book of Joel, just a couple of books away in what we refer to as the minor prophets. In Joel chapter 2, Joel gives us another instance of fasting. If I can get my pages to come unstuck. Joel chapter 2, and in verse, let's begin in verse 12. And so Joel is trying to encourage Israel to return to God. And it says, yet even now, declares the Lord, return to me with all your heart, with fasting and weeping, with mourning, and rend your hearts and not your garments. You see, traditionally, when the Israelites would fast because they had sinned, they fell away from God, traditionally what they did, and when we studied the kings of Israel, they would rent their clothes. They would tear their clothes. They would put ashes on their head, and they would replace their clothes with sackcloth, because that misery reminded them of how miserable of failures they were as human beings, and how they had let God down, and so they would sit this way. You see, Job sat in sackcloth and ashes in mourning the torment that he was under. And David rent his clothes. Various kings would rent their clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes. David did that when his son was very ill. And so Joel is telling the children of Israel to return to God with fasting and weeping and with mourning. But notice verse 13, what Joel says. And rend your hearts. In other words, tear your hearts. You see, the heart is where it's all at. Their hearts were not right with God, and so God wanted them to tear their hearts, to get rid of the section of their lives that was not in accordance with His will. He says, and not your garments. Return to the Lord your God, for He is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. And He relents over disaster. So that's the purpose. Fasting was often done on certain festival days. There were ritual fasts. Some fasting was custom of habit. We see that in Luke. I'm not going to go there for time's sake, but in Luke, Jesus talks about a Pharisee who's offering a prayer and a sinner who's offering a prayer. And the Pharisee makes a statement in his prayer to God, how righteous he is, I fast twice a week. You see, that was a custom of habit. And in all likelihood, the Pharisees who are questioning Jesus in the previous paragraph in Matthew chapter 9 are probably in the habit of fasting as this Pharisee did, twice a week. There's fasting, as I mentioned, in Daniel, a sign of mourning. You could see that again in 2 Samuel chapter 1, verse 12. Sometimes fasting was done before facing danger. Oftentimes there was a fast to purge Israel, to get them in a mindset to go to battle. We see, if we go back, I'm not going to again for time's sake, in Esther chapter 4, verse 16. Esther is about to go in and face the king to plead for the lives of the Jewish people, the lives of her people. And so Esther, before she goes in to do that, she has a fast. And that is the purpose of that, is to help her to focus on what's important by depriving herself. You know, fasting was for many an act of drawing attention to themselves, unfortunately, in Jesus' day. You go back to Matthew chapter 6, you see what was going on. They would fast, but it was for an outward appearance. And Jesus cautions against this kind of fasting. In Matthew chapter 6, go back to verse 16. We see here, Matthew chapter 6, verse 16, and when you fast, do not look gloomy like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces, that their fasting may be seen by others. Okay, so in other words, they don't do general hygiene. They're not washing their face. They're not combing their hair. They take on this haggard look, you know, and just like, oh, I'm so hungry. I'm on a fast right now. And they do that. Can't you imagine someone coming in, you know, they want attention. I'm going to pick on I had a great aunt that was that way. She always wanted attention, poor thing. And she would just always had this string of complaints about how her life was. And she did it for attention. Now, I'm not trying to pick on my great aunt or anything, but I think we probably all know people in our lives who crave attention. And so these people in Jesus' day were fasting because they craved attention. That's the wrong reason. That's the wrong reason. And so Jesus addresses that in Matthew chapter 6.